Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second day of our conference on foreign perspectives on European identity, European sovereignty. As I already explained yesterday, the conference is part of a major conference series on Europe. It's part of the Excellence Strategy Program of the University of Hamburg, and we are quite happy that we received funding for you continuing that project for all in all 7 years. We started in quite difficult times during the Corona pandemic, and therefore we did many things online, such as this conference, but we also had the pleasure to have one in-presence event this late fall. We went to the Villa Vigoni at Lake Como in October and were perfectly hosted by the director, Mrs. Niehaus. We had a wonderful, very intensive and fruitful discussion where we, I think, also, highlighted the issues that we are discussing today. And we had yesterday, I think, already very fruitful perspectives on European integration from a Chinese, from a Taiwanese, from an American, and from an Israel angle. So we were discussing also, and I found it very fruitful. It was a remark by Professor Salzberger yesterday that, the terminology of, foreign perspectives of insiders and outsiders is to some extent misleading because, it implies the category of inclusion and exclusion, which is maybe not convincing. And therefore, I'd like to start today's presentation and today's first session with the remark that, of course, we know that neither Professor Kelemen nor Professor Sarlet are outsiders or are foreign to the topic. You are in the middle of these debates and discussions. You are definitely insiders. And nevertheless, you can contribute constitutions which are not in a narrow sense European. Because I think that was another outcome of yesterday's session, that one of the problems of the European Union is that the Union is momentarily so much focused on its own internal problems with democracy, with the rule of law, with reforms, with, how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and so many other things, that, the Union is seen as a very self-centered organization that cannot transform its internal values, aims, and purposes in something more meaningful on the global plane. And that kind of, narrow, self-centered, reception and vision of the European Union, this is something which we want to overcome by, having established that forum and by having your perspectives on the European Union. I'm very excited and thrilled that we will learn quite a lot of new things this afternoon. I very much welcome Professor Kellerman, Professor Sarlet, and Mrs. Niehaus, and, the floor is now all yours, Mrs. Niehaus. If you start with the moderation and, welcome everybody to a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Kotzer. I'm very delighted of moderating this third panel on losing leadership, perceptions of the EU with regards to environmental and climate policy and the enforcement of human rights. I'm very excited also that we have found two distinguished speakers from Brazil and the United States, Professor Sarlet and Professor Kelemen. First of all, let me just say some words about the housekeeping rules of this panel. I would kindly ask you to mute yourselves and only unmute yourself when you are talking. And if you like to switch on your video, I think that would be nice, so at least we could see each other. However, there's of course no obligation to do so. And regarding questions, I think we should first hear both presentations, and then we have around 1 hour for discussion and questions. Also, there's a Q&A section where you can ask questions directly and comment. Nevertheless, there will be time for discussion after the 2 presentations. So this panel addresses environmental issues and the enforcement of human rights and the role of the European Union to do so. And we're listening to 2 perspectives from, well, not outside, but the middle, nevertheless, 2 new very interesting approaches to these issues from our 2 speakers. So first, let me introduce Professor Sarlet, who is a Brazilian jurist and retired magistrate from the State Appeal Court, and who is also a full professor of state law at the Pontifícia Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. He is mainly known for his academic works in the areas of constitutional law and human rights. He's also a full member of the Brazilian Academy of Constitutional Law. He holds a doctorate in law from the University of Munich with a diploma revalidated as Doctor of State Law by the University of São Paulo. He was a visiting researcher at Georgetown Law Center and Howard Law School, at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch, at the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Private Law in Hamburg, and at the Max Planck Institute for Social Law in Munich. He was also a visiting professor at the Doctorate in Human Rights of the Pablo de Olavide University in Sevilla in Spain, of the Portuguese Catholic University, of the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon, and of the Master's course in European Constitutional Law of the University of Granada in Spain. Mr. Sarlet, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to participate at the Hamburg-Vigoni Forum about foreign perspectives on European identity. I deeply thank Professor Markus Kotzur and Dr. Eva Lepton for the kind invitation. And I thank Mrs. Andrashko for all her support. I'll also greet my panel colleagues, Professor Dan Kellerman and Mrs. Manuela Niehaus for the moderation. It's a pleasure to share these moments with them. I also apologize. I'm not a fluent English speaking guy, but I will do my best to be understood. That's why I will read my short presentation. I'm also not an expert in European law, but I will try to establish some links because there's so much I could really try to connect here between America, Brazil, and Europe in relation to human rights, fundamental rights, and especially environmental law and climate issues nowadays that I really was able just to select a couple of aspects. The link between human and fundamental rights in general and environmental protection, and above all the problems and challenges related to climate change, are global and ubiquitous. And in this context, the decisive importance of environmental integrity and a safe climate as a factual condition for the effectiveness of all other human and fundamental rights has been largely and globally highlighted. Not only climate legislation and climate governance, but also climate litigation is gaining space, which is also an important connection point between Europe and Brazil, as well as between Europe and other countries. The last years, we have seen several law cases being decided, important cases being decided in Europe, Ireland, in Netherlands, in Germany this year, in France, Conseil d'État, but in Brazil as well, we have several cases going on in Colombia, in Argentina, in US. So it's something growing and it's good, but on the other side, it has, of course, its side effects. In addition of the exchange of experience in the field of environment, economic relationship between Europe and Brazil and other South American countries is still significant and can be affected by the environmental and climatic question. Just to have an idea, in 2020, as a result of the pandemic caused by coronavirus, exports from Brazil to the European Union fell 13% compared to 2019. But even though the total amount of export was $26.82 billion, placing the European Union as Brazil's second largest trading partner. On the other hand, Brazil is the fourth largest destination for foreign direct investment outside the European Union and the second largest supplier of agricultural products to the European market. After the conclusion of negotiations for the commercial trade between Mercosur and the European Union, an increase in the Brazilian GDP of $87.5 billion in 15 years, reaching $125 billion if the reduction of non-tariff barriers and the expected increase of the total productivity of production sectors are considered is expected. It will represent the largest free trade area in the world, integrating 80 million people and a total GDP of $20 trillion, approximately 25% of the world economy. This agreement rules were established to reiterate the commitment of the parties to the protection of working conditions and environment, acting in a comparative way for the effectiveness of the human rights, enshrining fundamental principles of the International Labour Organization and the objectives of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development. Specifically, the parties agreed to observe the Paris Agreement, protect biodiversity, establish the sustainable management of forests and fisheries, cooperate with exchange of information, and provide for the participation of civil society and the inspection of activities. Furthermore, the political agreement provides for the precautionary principle as a pillar to be observed for sustainable development, safety, and health at work. However, the principle cannot be applied to impose unjustified barriers to trade. Such outlines are important as they precede the implementation of the European Ecological Pact, including policies and strategies to fight global warming and its consequences as climate change. Created in December 2019, the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, provides, as you know, not only for the reduction of greenhouse gases, but also to generate jobs and boost innovation. It's a kind of revolution in the region's production chain, a new growth strategy aimed at transforming the European Union into equitable and prosperous society, endowed with the modern resource efficient and competitive economy, using the Next Generation EU fund, which totals 750 billion euros, with the expectation of reaching 1 trillion euros by 2027. It seeks to rebuild post-COVID Europe into a greener, more digital and more resilient space. Among the main focuses of the European Green Deal are the reduction to at least 55% by 2030 and to zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. The optimization of land circular economy, which promotes management waste and foster innovation technology. And Brazil, what about Brazil regarding environmental protection and fighting climate change and human rights? Despite and excluding recent political manifestations and developments, mainly the last 3 years, it is safe to say that the environmental protection tradition in Brazil, including actions against climate change in general, has been relatively successful in accordance with international European goals and standards. In 1981, the National Environmental Policy was created with the objective of regulating the various activities involving the environment, stimulating the preservation, improvement, and recovery of environmental quality, and with the goal of assuring a sustainable development. With the democratization process in 1988, the, at the time, new federal constitution included, along with several other rules about environment, a fundamental right to a healthy and balanced environment, besides strengthening the rule of law, the democratic institutions, the access to justice, and the independence and autonomy of the judicial branch and the public ministry, as well as the collective action to protect environment and other collective rights and interests. This very broad policy was followed by a series of specific statutes and the actualization of others, including the National Climate Policy Act from 2009. Brazil also has taken part in general in all important international conferences about environment and climate, and signed the most important declarations, treaties, covenants, and documents in general since then. The same can be said about human and fundamental rights in general. The Constitution of 1988 contemplated by far the most generous catalogue of civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights in Brazilian history, and probably one of the largest in the world. Another aspect to underline is that the Constitution, for the first time, included a specific chapter dedicated to international relations. Among the fundamental principles at the beginning of the Constitution, including the prevalence of human rights. And besides this, a specific opening clause establishes that the rights enshrined in international treaties ratified by Brazil are included in the fundamental rights catalog. This scenario appears, of course, to be even ideal, considering what we used to call law in the books, because as it happens everywhere, even in Europe, there is always a bigger or smaller gap between the normative program in legal texts, in constitutions, and of course, the harsh reality. But let's take a look at the reality focusing greenhouse emissions and the conservation of forests in Brazil. And then we come to the last part about, again, some connections between Europe and Brazil. After reaching a high level of devastation, more than 14,000 square kilometers a year, in 2004, forest devastation. In 2004, Brazil instituted the most successful fight against deforestation in the world with the Action Plan for Prevention and Control of Deforestation, the Legal Amazon, which made it possible to reduce the destruction of green areas by 83% between 2004 and 2012. It was a golden age of environment protection in Brazil. However, in the years following 2012, the fight against deforestation found itself stagnated, and unfortunately from 2014 onwards, it began to weaken with gradual increase because of the political and economical crisis that for various reasons plagued the country until nowadays. Concerning the problems related to global warming, which in turn is directly connected to climate change, Brazil, although having signed the Paris Agreement, which was ratified by National Congress in 2016, has not had a particularly encouraging development. On the contrary, the increasingly accelerated advance of the environmental degradation rates, particularly the massive destruction of forests, mainly due to the indiscriminate and to a large extent deliberated deforestation, has harmed the country's reputation in the international scenario. Among the commitments made by Brazil, it must be highlighted the reduction of greenhouse emissions up to 37% by 2025 and up to 43% by 2030 in comparison of the levels of 2005. Furthermore, the country has committed to increase the use of alternative energy sources, implementing the share of sustainable bioenergy in the energy mix up to 18% by 2030, using clean technologies in industrial companies, reducing the remaining deforestation and reforesting up to 12 million hectares, to mention the most important ones. The National Policy on Climate Change, instituted by the Brazilian Federal Act in 2009, as I mentioned, established an expectation towards reducing the deforestation rates in the Amazon region by 80% in 2020 compared to the average between 1996 and 2005. In practice, the destruction should reach a maximum area of 3,925 square meters per year. However, the opposite had occurred from 2008 to 2020, according to data collected and published by the National Institute for Space Research. The deforested area in the Amazon, which was 13,300 square kilometers in 2008, after the very significant reduction between 2009, 6,300 square kilometers, and 2012, 4,400 square kilometers, almost tolerant level, grew again at a dizzying speed. Between 2013, 5,400 square kilometers, and had its most considerable increase in 2019, 10,900 square kilometers, and finally this year, only between January and October, we have had again 13,320, about more than 13,000 square kilometers, and the expectation is we will pass the 14,000 square kilometers we had in 2004. And larger area than the Republic of Montenegro, and this is the worst rate in 15 years. Based on that data from 2020, Brazil has been following the opposite way to the rest of the world in terms of greenhouse emissions. According to our agency, the greenhouse gas emissions and removal estimation system, while other countries reduced during the pandemics their emissions by 6.7%, we in Brazil increased our emissions by 9.5%, an increase comparable only to the year 2006. You go many steps back. Many governmental actions and omissions at the Brazilian federal level were highly detrimental to the environmental and harmed the climate. Among these actions and omissions, it is possible to mention the extinction of the Department for Climate Change and Forests and the so-called Amazon Fund, which was the largest project of international cooperation for the preservation of the Amazon forest, and has received donations from the governments of Norway and Germany. So it's a connection with Europe, and both extinctions occurred at the beginning of 2019. But notice, everything is bad news. Despite the frightening numbers, the Brazilian government finally reaffirmed during the 26th conference in Glasgow its commitment to zeroing out illegal deforestation in the country, even emphasizing that it would do so by the year 2028. Let's have hope. In 2020, this year, the National Policy on Payment for Environmental Services was instituted to create economic incentives aimed at protecting the flora, such as compensation, monetary or not, linked to a certificate of reduction of emissions from deforestation, degradation, green bonds, and environmental reserve quotas. Another positive aspect is that the Brazilian energy matrix is composed of 45% of renewable sources, while in the world only 14% of the energy matrix is renewable. We have the conditions, the preconditions, of course, to reverse this scenario. It's in fact a political question, a political will, a political decision. To close this part, and it's important to underline the increasing role played by the judiciary in the field of environmental protection, especially in the last years, and the impressive number of cases submitted, accepted and decided by the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court, recently including cases directly and indirectly related to climate changes. In this case, as we will see next, the European influence has been highly important. Last part, what can Brazil learn from Europe? A possible dialogue. Although the immense differences between the Brazilian and European reality, there are a lot of common aspects that could be explored in a positive way to strengthen environmental protection, facing climate change, and making human and fundamental rights more effective. Considering the lack of time, I choose two aspects. The first one is related to climate litigation. In this regard, one can observe that in the Brazilian legal literature and judiciary experience, the major influence, especially when it comes to constitutional law and fundamental rights and constitutional jurisdiction, the major experience and influence comes from Europe, especially from Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy. This has been also the case in environmental litigation and even climate litigation. Dogmatic categories as duties of protection, proportionality test, undersize ban, that's maybe a possible translation for the German Untermaßverbot, ecological subsistence minimum, even the precautionary principle are currently used also by the Brazilian Federal Supreme Court, as well as European literature and jurisprudence are often cited by our Federal Supreme Court and of course in our legal literature. And this is of course due to a lot, really increasing number of Brazilian scholars. They have done their studies, legal studies, in doctorate and postdoctorate in several European countries the last 20, 30 years. And even judges, they are in our Supreme Court, they have studied in Europe. And so that's a really strong dialogue between our legal orders. And also the cases, the climate litigation cases, as I mentioned, Netherlands, Ireland, Belgium, Germany, France, they have been studied in Brazil, commented in Brazil, in the news, in even legal literature. And so they are also being taken seriously in our own cases and opinions delivered in our judgments. So this is, I think, a very strong dialogue which is going on in this regard. And it's also important to know that during the 26th conference of the parties, the British Institute of International and Comparative Law presented the Declaration on Climate Change, Rule of Law, and the Courts, which establishes 7 guiding principles for interpreters and applicators of law, and the Courts, which establishes 7 guiding principles for interpreters, around the world to give visibility of climate emergencies to the jurisdictions, such as an imperative engagement, balancing of powers between the organs of the state, role of climate science and the law, interpretation of the law in the current reality, protection of environmental defenders, global partnership and dialogue among judges, appeal to the world community. And these principles are also principles, they are universal. They are really connecting principles which can be, of course, applied, easily applied, and connect, I think, jurisdiction, judges, and of course, rule of law principles, human rights principles in all over the world, and connect again European identity with in a solidarian and of course worldwide way. The second and final approach, very short, so I apologize for this, but it's very short, I selected was presented recently, last week, by an important German scholar in a conference done for us in Porto Alegre, but online, Professor Christian Kalisz from the Free University Berlin. He is a former member of an expertise commission for environmental issues at the German government. What he sustains is that we should start from the concept of ecological planetary boundaries, which means regarding climate changes, among other aspects, the target of keeping human-induced global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, if possible, even 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This is not, of course, from him, but is the concept adopted by the decision of the European Parliament and the Council on the General Union Environment Action Programme 2030, at the recent 8th European Action Programme. In this sense, we need to work, and this we can do not only in Europe, but worldwide, the scenario of safe space of action to not transgress tipping points of irreversible environmental damages and devastation scenario. And the most important aspect created in this 8th European Action Programme is a new monitoring framework, but to be effective, to underline this experience we can transpose also to Brazil, is a transnational monitoring institution or agency with, of course, sufficient resources and legal and procedural tools to really act and make this procedure and this framework effective. And of course, this concept of a monitoring framework and a dependent institution is, in theory, of course, not difficult to be implemented or created and implemented also in Brazil and other countries, considering the preconditions of our constitutional legal order, because we have these preconditions. We have also in Brazil the concept of the German concept even of the objective dimension of fundamental rights, the right to take part at organization and procedural and the organisatory and procedural aspect of fundamental rights, and the right to take part at organization and procedural aspects, We have this in our legal system, even implemented to some extent in the environmental law. We have environmental council. It's a very important council with even normative power and competences. And in this council, so it is the really big council which protects environmental law in Brazil. And in this council, we have a very big representation of civil society, or NGOs, and economy. People from the economy are sitting in this council, and they have the right to vote. And this council has a normative power, and they have done a very important work in terms of protecting environment in Brazil. So we have this experience, participation from civil society in the environment governance in Brazil. So this is a feasible approach also for Brazil. What this 8th EAP proposal now is offering for the European Union. So I think we have a lot to do. We have a lot, really promising dialogue to undertake between Europe and Brazil and other countries, of course. And I hope this very few keynotes could be a step for this. Sorry for being so a little bit confusing, but it's maybe for the discussion, I have opened the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarlet. That was very interesting. And now we move on straight away to the second speaker, which is Professor Dan Kellerman, who is a professor of political science and law and Jean Monnet Chair in European Union politics at Rutgers University. Kelemen's research focuses on the politics of the European Union, law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative public policy. His 2011 book, Eurolegalism, The Transformation of Law and Regulation in the European Union, won the Best Book Award from the European Union Studies Association. He's the author or editor of 5 other books and author of over 100 articles and book chapters. Prior to Rutgers, Kelemen was a fellow in politics, Lincoln College, University of Oxford. He has been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, visiting fellow in the program in Law and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and a Fulbright Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Kelemen is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he publishes regularly in Foreign Affairs magazine. Kelemen comments regularly on EU affairs for European and American media, and he has extensive experience consulting on EU affairs for political risk analysis firms and policymakers. He was educated at UC Berkeley and Stanford. Mr. Kelemen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks to the hosts and to Professor Kotzer for his comments, my fellow panelist, Professor Sarlet. Enjoyed your presentation very much. And let me just jump right in and add a few of my thoughts on essentially the questions you put to us for this panel. Let me remind everyone what was said in the introduction, and we got some sort of briefing notes ahead of this. We were asked 2 central questions, really. Has the EU lost credibility as a global standard bearer of values-based policies, particularly regarding climate change and the enforcement of fundamental rights? Or did such leadership never exist really in the first place? Was it always kind of a myth? Well, I'm going to try to provide my thoughts on those 2 questions. So first, I would say that while I think the EU never lived up entirely to its own rhetoric about being a so-called normative power in areas such as environmental protection or defense of fundamental democratic rights, such leadership did exist. So it wasn't a complete myth. Yes, they may have overstated the level of their leadership there. There's always, shortcomings and some degree of hypocrisy, but there was, I think, real leadership in these areas. If you go, let's say in the 1990s, for instance, when there was really, I think, the most talk about the EU as a normative power on the world stage, and into the early 2000s. Sadly, I think the EU has lost a substantial amount of that leadership when it comes to the protection of fundamental democratic rights by falling short of its own professed values. I think it holds on to more leadership when it comes to environmental protection and countering climate change specifically, in terms of the rigor of its own policies compared to those of other major powers in the world. However, I do think the EU's ability to steer other key players on the world stage in environment has also diminished. So to sum all that up, I think what I'm going to talk about is that I think, in short, the EU has lost some credibility as a normative power in these fields, but really, it clings on to some leadership, basically because the competition for leadership on these values-based policies and on climate policy globally is so weak. As they say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? And so when you have the US and China with their as other sort of the other major powers on the world stage, looking very weak in regards to these kind of policies, then the EU almost by default remains a leader to some extent. Okay, so let's discuss each of these in turn a bit more specifically. Let me start with climate policy and environmental policy more generally before I go to kind of fundamental rights. So I think the EU's leadership in this arena goes back primarily to the early 1990s. This is something I wrote about years ago in some work with David Vogel, professor from Berkeley. And as we discussed then, prior, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, really the US was the world's environmental leader. The US was the main champion of multilateral environmental agreements. The EU countries generally went along with these, but a lot of the pressure came initially from the US, including on things like efforts against the emission of chlorofluorocarbons, the Montreal Protocol, et cetera. But then, basically from the early 90s, the US retreated from leadership. It's a long story, I won't go into it here, but the US hasn't passed any significant domestic environmental legislation since 1991, and hasn't been a leader on the world stage on environmental issues, basically because the Republican Party has turned against science and against environmental protection. And so the US has retreated entirely. And the EU really did step up then in the 90s. Now, why did they do that? Again, long story, won't go into all that. But I think in short, and it's worth mentioning this because it remains true today, that there are strong domestic forces within Europe demanding high standards of environmental protection, including robust action on climate change. And so essentially in countries with strong green parties, strong environmental lobbies, they're going to have tough environmental legislation domestically anyway, and the EU is going to do it collectively. So therefore it becomes in their interest to be a global leader on the world stage and try to not have Europe go it alone, but try to encourage other countries around the world to also up their efforts. Because of course, if Europe is the only one doing robust action, first, it would be ineffectual, and second, it would put them at a competitive economic disadvantage, right? And so that's kind of the origin of this leadership from the EU. And you saw that, I think really the high point was the Kyoto Protocol, where remember the US opposed that, but through EU leadership, they managed to get that ratified and pressured other states. So that I think was the high point of EU leadership. Now, the EU continues to have strict environmental standards, and Professor Sarlet mentioned, things like the European Green Deal. There's some of the operationalization of that with the Fit for 55 initiative. So, the EU has raised its ambitions with the recent climate law for committing to emissions reductions of 55% by 2030. There's the longer term goals of climate neutrality by 2050. So, the EU is pushing domestically, and it wants other countries to join it, right? It wants to be an environmental leader, a normative power on the world stage. But I think, the truth is that unlike back in the late 90s with Kyoto, the EU just doesn't have the power or influence to force others along the way it did then. Partly that's because, of course, when you go back to Kyoto, there, the understanding was that developing countries wouldn't be forced to make binding reductions. It was really, an agreement for binding cuts among developed countries. And the EU had enough weight in that sphere. But now that, basically, I think the widespread agreement is you can't have meaningful climate action on the world stage unless you get, China on board and others. And the EU just doesn't have the heft to pressure both the US and China, into something. So therefore, you end up with something like the Paris Agreement. I won't say too much. Look, I have to say I'm quite cynical. A lot of people, laud the Paris Climate Accords as this, huge agreement. I guess I'm old enough to remember Kyoto and binding cuts, and I look at Paris, and to me, it's a big nothing burger because, it's just, commitments to make efforts. It's not, it's better than nothing for sure, but it's not like what the EU would have liked to see, which is, forcing binding commitments on countries. So, I think that's where we are on climate. Now, let me turn quick next to protection of fundamental rights. Here, I think the picture is much more bleak, and it's really, it's a hard thing to say keep in mind, because I'm going to say a lot of negative things, right? But just keep in mind that I'm a big Europhile, right? I'm a Jean Monnet chair. I'm a fan of the EU, always have been. I believe in the project of European integration. With all that said, let's get to the dirty business. The EU got a reputation as a leader on democratic values. Principally, one of the key ways it got that was through promoting democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law in the accession process. Okay, and that goes back. You can look at the earlier rounds of accession where you had, states in Iberia and Greece joining after they were dictatorships, and always the idea was you had to be a democracy, have rule of law to join. That was made more explicit, of course, prior to Eastern enlargement with the establishment of the Copenhagen criteria. And, the EU was quite rightly viewed as a promoter of these values. And that was one of the key reasons cited, for instance, when the EU won the Nobel Prize in 2012, the Nobel Peace Prize. And on top of that accession thing, I think more generally, the EU promoted these democratic values and human rights in its fledgling foreign policy. So, it would have provisions in trade agreements to do with this. The EU, where it had the status to do so, would sign on to international human rights related treaties, things like that. EU member states backing, the ICC, et cetera. So the EU across the board and its member states were viewed as leaders in this area. Okay, but now times have changed, even if the rhetoric of democracy and human rights remains. And again, before I go into this, let me just say we should keep this in perspective, because while advocates of democracy and human rights may be rightly very disappointed with the EU, feel it has lost credibility as a normative power in this field, which I think it has, we have to keep it in perspective. Back to what I said before, leadership is a matter of position relative to others. And in these fields, the competition is very weak, because who are the other leaders? Well, look at Pew, the Pew Foundation does polling on global public opinion in a host of countries from North America, Europe, Asia, et cetera. And there you see things like that the US is not viewed as a good model of democracy. I think the most recent poll, only 17% of those surveyed viewed the US as a good model of democracy. This is kind of the Trump effect, right? Overwhelming majorities have negative views of China. Quite rightly, of course, because it's a dictatorship that is perpetrating a genocide in Xinjiang, among other things. So, So again, the EU has a lot of shortcomings, which I'm going to mention. That being said, it still remains in relative terms, seen, I think, as somewhat of a leader in these fields. Okay, but let's go to the ugly stuff then. The EU is home, according to the VDEM Institute, the leading body that sort of rates regime types, democracy, autocracies, etc. That's based in Stockholm. The EU is home to the two most rapidly autocratizing states in the past decade. So in terms of the states that have shifted the most downward on the democracy rating index from democracy toward autocracy, the two fastest autocratizers in the world. So again, not the most dictatorial, of course, but the most backsliding, right? Regimes are Poland and Hungary, right? Both EU member states. The EU is now home officially to its first competitive authoritarian regime, Hungary, which bodies like VDEM and Freedom House no longer rank as a democracy. Okay, so let's be clear, the EU is no longer a union of democracies. It is a union of mostly democracies and at least one autocracy. By next year, I think Poland will also probably be downgraded, certainly after they cheat in the next elections. Okay, so basically the EU comfortably houses autocratic regimes, so that definitely damages its credibility. Now, I can talk more in the Q&A, why the EU has let this happen. I've written a lot about that. The EU is trapped in what I call an authoritarian equilibrium for a host of reasons, where essentially EU leaders have refused to take action using the many tools they have to stop this backsliding. Instead, in many cases, they have covered up for or even promoted it. And it's worth saying that, because the EU fails to stand up to democratic backsliding and continues to hand these regimes billions. Now, let me just pause and say, now there's some action where the EU has frozen some of the recovery funds to Poland and Hungary, and there's talk about suspending more of their funding. We'll see where that goes. But for the time being, it is just a factual statement, even if it sounds provocative, to say the EU is one of the major funders of democratic backsliding in the world, okay? Because it lavishes huge sums on these regimes as they dismantle democracy. So they do it with EU money, okay? And then the next thing is that, you could say, well, okay, that's a problem in Hungary and Poland, but, the EU is a big union, 27 countries. If there's a couple problematic countries, maybe that's not so bad. Fair enough, perhaps, but the problem is that these backsliders are then poisoning EU institutions, because they have seats at the table in Brussels, in Strasbourg, where they can poison the EU. Let me give just one example of that. EU enlargement policy, which again was one of the key areas where it got its sort of reputation as a promoter of democracy and fundamental values. Well, in exchange, let's go back to when President von der Leyen was elected, right? First of all, as president of the European Commission, the EU's executive, she was only able to be elected by getting votes from Hungary and Poland from the governing parties, right? She needed their votes in the council and their support in the European Parliament. And so she made a dirty deal with Orban and Kaczynski, the rulers of those regimes, in order to get power. And part of that dirty deal was she gave Orban control over EU enlargement policy. His lackey, a guy named Oliver Varhey, is now the Commissioner for Enlargement. So EU enlargement policy no longer has any credibility as a promoter of rule of law and democracy in candidate states, because the person in charge of it is a servant of Orban's. And that has real effects. For instance, Serbia, which very recently the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, just like a week ago, kicked Serbia off its rating system of democracies, saying it's become an autocracy now. And yet the EU, in its recent reports on Serbia's progress toward accession, has given it very favorable reviews, right? Saying everything's going well, rule of law, democracy. Why? Because Orban's servant is writing those reports, okay? So again, the process is losing credibility. And I could say the same thing about his approach to Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I won't go into that. All right, now beyond, enlargement and sort of, so there's democratic values where the EU is failing to stand up for them. How about human rights? Well, let's talk for a second about and I'm almost done here, Manuela, if I have like a couple more minutes.
That's fine.
Yeah, let's talk about EU migration policy. I was planning to talk to you here about some of the EU's sins and violations of fundamental rights in the sphere of migration. Of course, there's a lot of material there to go on, but I couldn't resist just bringing up something from actually a story here in the US on National Public Radio yesterday. I don't know if this has gotten any play in the US, but in the EU, but an investigative journalist was interviewed on our National Public Radio who had been following a story of a farmer. Well, he'd been following the situation in Libya with migrants housed there more generally, but this was based on a story he wrote in the New Yorker, and he was interviewed about it. And he followed the story of a migrant from Guinea-Bissau named Aliou Kande, who was intercepted while trying to cross the Mediterranean and then returned to Libya to a refugee prison called Al-Mabani, where, quote, extortion, rape, and murder are commonplace, and where the captors use the migrants as business opportunities, squeezing them, basically extorting them. If you want to try to call home, you have to have money sent to us, this sort of thing. And then the interviewer asked the journalist, what is Europe's responsibility here? Now, let me just quote for a second, because this is really worth listening to. Again, it's an ugly thing to hear for Europhiles like me. Urbina, the journalist. Yeah, I mean, the entire system is funded and guided by the EU, quite especially in this case with Libya and Italy in particular. The aerial assets in this war against migration is run by Frontex. That's the EU migration agency, right? Which is the EU's border agency. So there are drones and airplanes monitoring the Mediterranean, looking for these rafts and reporting them. The intel is then handed to the Libyan Coast Guard, an EU-funded force that goes out, scoops them up in so-called rescue missions, which are actually arrests, and then takes them to these awful places. Again, this is one story, but there's lots more material here. It's not an isolated incident. The EU's entire approach since the migration crisis in 2015 has been premised basically on violating fundamental rights. I mean, look at the EU-sponsored hotspots, which were set up in Greece to help process refugees, 2015-16. Human rights bodies, organizations that had been working with the EU in the process of reception and hearing asylum claims pulled out and refused to cooperate. So for instance, Human Rights Watch in 2016 says, we can't have anything to do with these hotspots because the unsafe and unsanitary conditions. Here's a quote from Human Rights Watch back in 2016. In Europe's version of refugee camps, women and children who fled war face daily violence and live in fear, right? So, this is the situation. Now, to be clear, there are forces in the EU that are pushing for human rights and better treatment of refugees and pushing for democracy in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. Largely, these forces are in the European Parliament. There are some parties, such as the Green Party, to a lesser extent the Liberals, who are, I think, quite strong on these issues. But mainstream European leaders in the European Council have, been horrible on this. And I mean, look, it's worth mentioning. I wrote an article this summer in Foreign Policy, which got a bit of attention. May have had me banned from Berlin for a while. I don't know. Not under the new government. But where I basically pointed out that the chief architect of many of these policies was the so-called leader of the free world, Angela Merkel, right? Who basically practiced what we called in this article mercantilism, right? Like a play on words. Actually, in German, it is the same word because Merkantilismus is spelled with an A in German. But anyway, you know, that I'm combining mercantilism and the name Merkel, right? And the point is, you know, her policy was to prioritize commercial interests over human rights concerns in terms of, you know, Hungary and Poland, and more broadly, let's say in the EU's relations, trade relationships. Merkel pushed at the end of her tenure very hard and got von der Leyen to back her investment deal with China, right? Now that, again, an example of these tensions was shot down by the European Parliament, in part because of the human rights concerns about what's happening in China, right? Vis-a-vis the Uyghur population, vis-a-vis Hong Kong, et cetera. But still, you know, we see that for too many European leaders, at the end of the day, they go back to, you know, the famous saying by Emperor Vespasian, pecunia non olet, right? Money doesn't stink, where they're basically, you know, happy to do, to ignore human rights and democratic values if it facilitates, you know, trade with distasteful regimes, right? So I'm afraid there's been too much of that and too little of prioritization of democratic values. That being said, you know, as I said earlier, while this is disappointing and while I think the EU has lost a lot of its credibility, it's still in a better position than most other world powers on these issues. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was quite interesting. And I'm sure we will hear a lot of comments and questions on both speeches, which were both interesting. And I would like to open the floor for such questions and comments. I see there have already been some questions in the Q&A section and also in the chat. How can Brazil, a developing nation, implement policies from first world nation countries which are developed now and are climate various only because they had previously exploited resources of these underdeveloped nations? Shouldn't the laws for climate and global warming be laid exclusively according to an underdeveloped nation, but not inspired from developed nations?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, I think we must separate a little bit. Of course, underdeveloped nations are underdeveloped to a certain extent because they were exploited by developed nations. And of course, we have huge problems, environmental problems, even in terms of climate changes and greenhouse gases and warming effects, because we have been exploited, exporting wood and minerals, and so because of course Amazon is of course a region, only to mention Amazon, a region which was highly exploited also by other countries, and even today there's a lot of traffic of wood to other countries. Of course, not officially, of course, it's a traffic, this is illegal, but this goes to other countries. A lot of resources, even for research, is going to other countries. So that's, of course, a very complicated trade-off. To one extent, it's considered illegal, and everyone said, okay, oh, that's bad. Brazil must pay for this. What's Brazil doing against the environment, all these other countries? But of course, someone is making money with this, and these are also European. These are also people in North America. These are also people in other countries. So this, of course, it's what in reality happens to a certain extent. And I think, but this on the other hand doesn't mean that that the developments in terms of the legal tools, in terms of course the legal regime of the environment protection laws can't be of course applied by underdeveloped countries. That's, I think, another thing, and even maybe in our countries, it's even more important that have institutions, they can apply these tools, this legal framework. So we need even more to apply this legal framework. So we really can learn from developed countries to apply this legal one. But of course, we need prepared institutions. We need independent institutions for this. And I think we are really creating, we have institutions willing to do this. We have, in fact, in Brazil, really, I think I can mention Brazil, and even some other countries in Latin America. We have, of course, a very huge clash between the branches of government. We have a huge clash, dispute between the judiciary and the executive branch, especially between the executive branch and the judiciary, not only in terms of environmental protection, but other questions, especially the pandemics turned this very visible, but we have dozens of important decisions in the last years in which the federal government was defeated in terms of measures which the government tried to reduce, to flexibilize measures protecting environment. So dozens of decisions of our federal Supreme Court defeating decisions, measures from our federal government. We have decisions in Colombia, in Argentina, in Peru. We have some important decisions in South America, pro-environment, using this legal framework. And so I think we have institutions, they could face this, but of course, without political will, without, of course, a shared responsibility between politics, between judiciary, between, of course, the economy and civil society, this won't be really possible. Law is not the only way to do this, but I think the framework, the universal principles of environmental law, we have developed all these years. They are, of course, applicable if you have institutions, the willingness to do so. I don't know if I understood the question, but it's not a question of having the possibility to apply these rules, but of course, the willingness and the institutions to do this. There's not a question to be underdeveloped or not. Underdevelopment can, of course, be a barrier because of the lack of resources to create these institutions, and of course to fund these institutions, to have enough power to implement, of course, this legal framework and these measures. Of course, to have an autonomous, independent, and effective monitoring agency, just to mention the example, I mentioned in my keynote speech, we need, of course, resources. To have a data authority and autonomous, independent, and effective data authority, we need resources. We need people, expertise, and we need, of course, financial, we need budget. And this is, of course, the weak part we have in underdeveloped countries. In Brazil, it's a little bit different because Brazil, it's a rich country. It's in fact a rich country. What we have is a really huge inequality. We have a huge concentration of richness. It's a rich country with a lot of poor people, but it's a rich country with a huge concentration of money and a huge level of evasion of taxes, evasion of money in fiscal paradises abroad. Even our finance minister has money at Cayman Islands, and all that's okay because it's legal. So that's an example. Our finance minister have money to Cayman Islands, and of course that's difficult to do something with this reality. So if you consider this reality, we in theory we have money, but the money is of course not really dedicated to social policies, to effective social policies, to really turn effective environmental protection and several measures. We have money, but the money, of course, goes to other purposes, usually to 1% of the Brazilian population. But of course, the reality in other countries is different. We are really poor countries in Latin America. In Brazil, we could have the possibility to do everything to implement this framework and really fight and have conditions to really develop these measures. So I hope, having answered, I don't know if I understood well the question.
Thank you, Mr. Sarlet. Wonderful. Then we have another question at the Q&A. Dear Professor Elementary, I think.
That's probably autocorrect when he tried to
I
type
think so.
element.
May I know how EU or other democracy bodies set boundaries with doing business with China and avoid being negatively affected by the dictatorship of China? As I understand, the dictatorship of Communism Party is not only focused within China, but they have broader interests worldwide, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and yes, the Chinese dictatorship does have much broader worldwide interests in trying to sort of promote its model and to resist efforts of the US and Europe to promote democracy. By the way, most recently there was quite something I can't recall ever seeing anything like it, which was the ambassadors of China and Russia to the US wrote a joint op-ed the other day criticizing President Biden's upcoming summit of democracies, right? Which I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it was something that President Biden promised during the election campaign, and now he's fulfilling that promise, was to convene a conference of democratic governments from around the world to sort of discuss their common values, discuss how to protect democracy from authoritarian threats, etc. By the way, Hungary is not invited, okay, to that. It's the only EU member state not being invited because it's not a democracy. But anyway, yeah, just to that question, China and Russia are criticizing, this and sort of saying, well, we are real democracies because we serve the people, blah, 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 something we've, of course, heard back throughout the history of communist dictatorships. Those in Germany will remember the name of East German communist dictatorship was the DDR, right? The German Democratic Republic. So anyway, I guess the point is, yes, these regimes have these broader global ambitions and they seek to undermine Western democracies, to cast doubt on their claims of leadership on human rights and all those things. Now, as to the question from Mr. Wenting Lee about how the EU sets boundaries in doing business with China to avoid being negatively affected, I think the short answer is the EU doesn't set effective boundaries, and nor does the US, by the way, in dealing with China. Rather, as I was suggesting, there's far too much sort of greed, or there's sort of European companies like American ones. So I'm not criticizing without criticizing my own country, but they salivate at the opportunities of the huge Chinese market, and they're willing to look aside, from concerns about human rights, whether that's in Hong Kong or Xinjiang, and the 1 million plus Uyghurs who are imprisoned in these concentration camps. and they're just willing to look aside if there's an opportunity for profit. And I think, unfortunately, what happens, basically there was this phrase that all the Germans audience will be familiar with about the idea of engaging with authoritarian regimes, with China, Russia, Wandel durch Handel, right? That, basically we would trade with countries that would lead them to change, liberalize, open up over time. And the US had kind of the same thinking in the 90s with its engagement with China. I think the sad reality is that what the trade has led to was change in us, not in them, right? China is more of a dictatorship today than it was 10 years ago. And what's happened instead is that by integrating our economies with those of authoritarian regimes, we have made ourselves more vulnerable. Just think of things like the NBA, right? National Basketball Association here. I'll just give that as an example. So I'm not just picking on the EU, but it would be, same thing there with let's say in Premier League soccer, or, well, I'll come to the Bundesliga in a second, but let's start with the NBA, where, you had this incident about a year ago where a coach of an NBA team, the Houston Rockets, wore a T-shirt in sympathy with the Hong Kong protesters. And then basically his team was banned from all television in China. Sale of their merchandise was banned, and the NBA basically made him stop wearing those shirts and said, "Don't harm our business in China." I mean, I think you have the same thing with sponsorships in European soccer. Again. And then, of course, we can turn to the car companies, and just goes on and on. The point is, our economic engagement has made us vulnerable to economic extortion from these regimes, and that has infected our own politics.
Dear Mrs. Niehaus, maybe briefly I've used my position to be a member of that panel and bring up a follow-up question, because the debate is really exciting, and I very much admire, Professor Kelemen, how you outlined why, the European Union has lost its credibility, a topic that we also have been talking about yesterday with Professor Weiler. And I was wondering, in the context of that kind of, economic pressure, so to speak, and also of the equilibrium trap that you described, there's very often the argument heard also within, European lawyers and also economists within the European Union saying we got a big problem if we do not give money to countries such as Hungary and Poland. That might open the floor for, China and others who then finance them, and that could worsen the situation. So there was, we had here at the Europa Kolleg the other day a conference with the president of a big economic research institution in Germany, Professor Felbermayr, and he said, yeah, if you stop giving money to, let us say, Hungary and Poland, then, China might step in and kind of, buy them. And there's that example, the Soros University had to leave Hungary, not being a democracy anymore, and now is reestablished in Vienna and Austria, and the Chinese are financing a research institution in Poland. And I think that's an interesting debate, and it very well describes sometimes also the argumentative trap the European Union finds itself in. And my question would be, Professor Kelemen, how would you react to these arguments? Is that something, is that something related to your, if you do business too strongly, if you too much rely on the economy, then you're trapped? Or is that also, how could the European Union effectively also answer these threats without being totally kind of, too benevolent to countries who, at the end of the day, erode the values?
Yeah, great. Can I go ahead, Manuela, and just answer that? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah? Of course.
So, yeah, very important question. And yes, of course, we hear that kind of argument all the time. I want to differentiate slightly, because you hear this both with, in respect to Hungary and Poland, which are already EU members. You also hear it with respect to candidate countries such as Serbia, where this is very much a live issue right now, with Serbia's relationship with China and Russia. But okay, in short, I would say yeah, I can understand those arguments, but ultimately I think they're nonsense. You know, I checked recently on the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation webpage, and they make it very clear. They have a page where they say they strongly recommend not paying off extortionists, right? You know, because it's very bad to pay off extortionists, because then they just extort more. Okay, so I mean, this idea that you should keep handing Hungary and Poland billions of EU taxpayers' money because they threaten that if you don't do that, we will, let's say, cause gridlock in the EU, or we will turn to China and Russia. First of all, if you do that, you're just giving into blackmail, and they'll just keep doing it while they violate all your rules and just, take your money. Secondly, your own taxpayers will eventually get fed up of financing, that. And, thirdly, maybe the worst part of it is that actually what that ignores is that in the end, what you do is you pay the extortion, the blackmail, and then they still serve the interests of these autocratic regimes. They play both sides, right? So, Hungary is the biggest Trojan horse for Putin inside the EU, and also on many issues promotes China's interests, right? And it does that, while having a seat in the table in the European Council. So I think, the idea that somehow you can buy peace by, paying off autocrats, it just doesn't work, and it won't work, and it's a fool's errand. So I don't buy it, number one. And then the whole second thing, if we stick with EU member states, and then I'll come quickly to accession candidates. This whole idea that like Hungary or Poland might leave the EU if they have their funds suspended is, I would stake my professional reputation on this, that they will not leave. They will never leave. Their populations overwhelmingly support EU membership. There would be literally revolution, right, in those countries before they would let their governments take them out of the EU. And these governments don't want to leave the EU because, unlike the ideologically deluded Tory party in Britain, they realize that their economy depends on EU membership. And yes, they want to keep the subsidies going, but even without the subsidies, they need the car factories and, the access to the European market. So they're not leaving. Rather, what they hope to do is stay inside and act as Trojan horses. And then with accession candidates, okay, I mean, there it is a little bit more tricky, I suppose, that, if you do not give, if we think of states in the states in between, so to speak, the states in between Russia and the EU, whether it's Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, that's another story, Serbia, the Balkan countries, or even Turkey. When we think of those countries, it's true that if you don't give them a kind of horizon for accession, that may increase the chance that they reorient their geopolitical, let's say they reorient themselves geopolitically, maybe embrace closer ties with Russia or China. So that's a risk. But here would be my last thought on that. I mean, do we really think countries are going to be, given what we've learned about, from letting in Hungary and Poland and seeing all the backsliding, now Slovenia, problems with others, does the EU really want to let in countries if their commitment to democracy and rule of law only depends on them being paid off with, subsidies? I think those aren't, I think the EU has shown its weakness in a way, so it really needs to have states that are committed for their own reasons internally, robustly, to democracy and the rule of law. You can't buy those values with subsidies.
Thank you. This was really interesting. Professor Sarlet, do you want to say something straight to this comment because you raised your hand?
Yes, if I may.
Of course.
I have in fact, I think it's a great opportunity to listen to Professor Kelemen, and since we have some time, and there is not another question for me. I allow myself to make a question because I'm interested, of course, in human rights and fundamental rights, and of course I have been reading and researching something about the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. I asked Professor Kelemen, in his opinion, there is of course something good, I think, if we, in my opinion, if we look at the role played by the European Court of Human Rights, especially the European Court of Human Rights, but maybe also the European Court of Justice regarding the implementation of the European Convention and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights as a positive, of course, example, and in this sense, maybe a kind of leadership in terms of human rights besides Europe. Of course, we have these bad examples. We have this regression. You, of course, have shown underlined very well in terms of democracy and rule of law, but maybe in the sense of human rights, we have here still an example that can be followed. What is your opinion about this aspect?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sarlet. Yeah, certainly I agree that, and this kind of goes back to the point I was trying to make. If we think in a big global context about where there's robust protection of human rights, then certainly the EU or the broader realm of countries participating in the European Convention on Human Rights, look like one of the leading lights in the world, certainly, right? And I don't want to discount that or say that everything is a disaster with human rights protection in Europe. That would be wrong. And certainly the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights has been a model for other courts, sort of regional courts with human rights focus in other regions of the world, as has in different ways jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. So yes, I take your point. I mean, that said, I think with the EC, I'm more of a specialist on European Union law than on European Court of Human Rights and the law and the European Convention. But I would say this. I guess I've always been a slight, I'll admit something here, as an EU law specialist, I've always been a slight skeptic about the European Convention and human rights and the European Court of Human Rights, in the sense that they don't quite have the same binding character as what EU law has had historically. And just let's take the point that Russia remains a member of the Council of Europe. Right. I mean, there was some suspension for a while, right, after Ukraine invasion. I'm not sure the status of that, but I guess the point is, yeah, and Russian human rights NGOs definitely do use the ECHR to try to protect the human rights of individuals in Russia, in the prison system and elsewhere. And actually, many of those individual cases, people win. And from what I understand, again, not my main specialty, but from what I read there, that actually many of those rulings are respected with respect to the individual case. People are paid compensation, whatever. But what really causes me doubts is that, in the bigger picture, even if you have these individual cases, we have a notorious authoritarian regime that's part of this system and at a systemic level continues, to violate rights. Same for Turkey. Right? Turkey, of course, dismantled its kind of fledgling nascent democracy, and Erdogan has dragged things back into, a system of competitive authoritarianism with mass human rights abuses. I mean, my university, my department is hosting a couple scholars at risk, from Turkey, through a foundation that funds people who've been chased out of their universities, right, because of attacks on academic freedom, and freedom of speech, et cetera, in Turkey, and yet, again, remains part of this system. So I guess I have my doubts as to the power. of the system ultimately.
All right, thank you. We have 3 more questions, I think. One is from Abongo Mashud Ajini, who asked, why don't EU tackle environmental law by banning the electronic waste they generate? Currently, the European Union indirectly plays a role in environmental pollution in Africa by allowing electronic waste to be exported to Africa. And this waste end up in the sea, destroying the environment because African countries do not have technology to properly dispose of these electronic waste. And it ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. Does any one of you want to say something to that question?
If I may say something, I really don't know. That's a really good question and a huge problem, not only in electronic disposal, but also we have the nuclear waste and another kind of waste. I really don't know exactly the specific rules about, no? But of course it's a worldwide problem in the South Pacific, in the South Atlantic, no? In the Antarctic, no? We have of course a lot of this problem going on, and it's of course a question of solidarity and power, economic and power and political power again. We must comply. Some countries, the southern countries, the global south must comply with certain environmental protection criteria, and the northern part must do the homework in their territory, but export their waste. So that's of course something that must be settled. Otherwise, we will still have the same problems. This shared responsibility, this equation between South and North, global South and global North, it's no problem, not only in terms of environmental, but also an economic problem, social inequality problem, refugees, the problem, of course, mentioned by Professor Kelemen regarding refugees, immigrants. It's of course a similar problem. What has been done with refugees involves also the relation between South and North, how to fix people to have a decent life in southern countries, to develop the countries, because if the countries would be developed with better conditions of life, better economies, but of course they would not, of course, search better conditions in other places. That's, I think, one part of a whole and more complex, but in fact, it's the same bigger picture. But more can say because they are specific, so specific rules that I really can't. And in Brazil, we have a specific legislation about waste and so on. But of course, that's waste coming from the north. And of course, what we do with this, we send it back. That's something different. So sorry, but I have tried to say something more general.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kellerman.
Yeah, so thanks to the questioner for that question. Like Professor Sarlet, I haven't, lately been following kind of the issue of waste electronics exports or the electronic waste trade enough to give an informed answer. But I just offer one thought, because I mean the EU does have a directive on waste electronics, and the proper disposal, recycling, trade, et cetera. That's the WEEE directive from 2012, which is, what's that stand for? Let's see, it's the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, which was older than that, but was sort of redone in 2012. And part of that directive is supposed to be to control illegal exports of waste electronics. That doesn't mean that all waste electronics exports are banned, but at least ones considered to be hazardous and dangerous are supposed to be restricted. So the law is there, which brings me to my main point. In response to this question, without having followed the issue more, I would just say this: an issue I have followed more lately is that the EU has gotten much weaker in the past 15 years or so. So actually, in the kind of period since this directive was adopted, at enforcing its own laws. Okay. In fact, it's interesting. Environmental law used to be one of the main areas that was famous for the EU taking a strict approach to enforcement, bringing many infringement actions against member states, right? But in a new paper I have we've finished our draft, it won't be published for a little while, but with Professor Tom Pavone from University of Arizona, we're looking at the big decline in enforcement of EU law by the European Commission. And environment is one of these areas where they just bring many dramatically less infringement actions. So I guess in response to the question, I would suspect, though I can't say for sure, that perhaps part of the problem on this issue isn't the lack of rules, but the lack of enforcement of those rules. That would be my suspicion.
Okay, thank you. I do have two questions of my own, one for Mr. Kelemen, one for Professor Sarlet. First to Professor Kelemen. You mentioned, and I've read your 2009 essay on trading places between the US and the European Union. And I was wondering, since you said it's basically the same still today, what the role of US litigation, climate litigation and environmental litigation in this context is. Because as you said, there has not been a lot of domestic legislation, but the US faced the largest amount of cases. And I was wondering, do you think this makes a change in international leadership? And my second question is to Professor Sarlet. Professor Sarlet, you said we have a dialogue between, or we should have a dialogue between Brazil and the European Union, and that Brazilian scholars are looking a lot into European cases, climate cases, like climate change litigation from, for example, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on. Do you perceive the same of European scholars? Do they look in South American cases, for example? Is this a dialogue which goes both ways, or is it just one way from north to south? So these are my two questions. Professor Kelemen, I would give the floor first to you.
Well, it's a great question, and I have to admit I'm not well positioned to answer it, primarily because in the last several years I've been focusing much more on, let's say, half of the theme of today's panel than the other half. I've been focusing much more on fundamental rights, democratic values, and those things than on environmental policy. The person you should really talk to is my former student, Lisa von Halle, professor now in the UK, who's been working for years now on climate litigation and leading a bunch of big projects on that. But I guess what I'd say is this: I think, yes, I mean, in a system that is where there's political gridlock preventing action on climate, legislative action like the US, litigation would seem to be one of the sort of entry points or pressure points that might unblock that. But to the best of my knowledge, from what I understand about it so far, US courts have not, been willing to force the hand of government, compelling them to undertake, significant new policies on climate change as a result of this kind of litigation. That's my understanding. But again, I haven't been following the issue closely enough to really speak on it. But I guess I have, even though I've worked a lot on sort of environmental litigation and litigiousness in the US, I guess ultimately I'd say I'd be skeptical if the courts in the US, particularly now that there's been a takeover by conservatives of the highest courts in the land, not only the Supreme Court, but, Trump stacked the judiciary, the federal judiciary with his judges. I would not look to the courts for progress on climate from the US. Maybe more, maybe I'd anticipate more success with that kind of climate litigation in European jurisdictions, national or EU level, where I think, there's much better prospect for that.
Thank you. Mr. Sarlet?
Okay, thank you for the question. I would say, of course, the weight, I think we have, of course, much more interest and I think much more Brazilian and even South American scholars, literature and policies looking at Europe, and of course it's diverse. Of course, if you look at Colombia and Peru and the Spanish-speaking world, of course they look much more at Spain than we look. Of course, we have strong relationships with Spain as well, but they have more. Some countries as Colombia, they are also very well connected with USA and Mexico. We also have good connections with certain scholars in US, but less than Europe. In Brazil, I think the strongest connections are, at least in the law field, for sure, with France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and UK. These are, of course, the main points of connection by far. And Germany is really increasing a lot in the last 20 years. It's really amazing how many scholars and students are doing doctorate or research and postdoctorate studies in Germany. And Germany has been also the biggest partner from Brazil in terms academic and scientific partner in terms of fundings and academic relationships with Brazil, along with US, France, and UK. It's a very, very strong, historical, very, very strong partner with Germany. So that's also a context, I think, that's very important to show why this happens, because there's conditions to, it's an important condition for this, first of all. Second, the opposite way is of course weaker, by far weaker, but this is changing. And this is changing, first of all, because with the time, a lot of foreign scholars, even Germany, are of course having more and more contact with our scholars, and of course being more interested in knowing about our legal order and other aspects. And of course we have more and more common aspects, and the dialogue is of course start to be more important because these issues like environment, climate change, data protection, artificial intelligence, terrorism, fighting terrorism, criminality, organized criminality. So we have, of course, a lot of real digitalization, really very broad global issues, and there are cooperative structures, necessary transnational regulatory frameworks, dogmatic categories, and this kind of cross-fertilization schemes, even in law, are broadening, are being more important, are increasing. And of course, a more common language is being built. And so I think this is, of course, a way which are turning even for other people, even for European scholars, more interesting, at least to listen more, to look at a little bit more what is going on in our countries. I think Markus Kutsur, of course, a very kind friend, but he was often with us and to be invited, and to exchange some ideas, and so of course to be open to hear, of course, and to be in Germany or in Europe, and several colleagues have been. So this is, I think, a way to strengthen this kind of dialogue, and to write papers. Now I'm publishing a paper with Professor Kahl about climate and constitution, comparison with Brazil and Germany, in the book by Springer. I'm organizing a book with Springer, with Professor Albert, Professor Kurz taking part, the common project, and so on. I think several things are going on, and I think this is due to this process, globalization process, which also involves all these categories. And environment and climate is, of course, surviving, decisive surviving connecting point for all of us, if you want or not. So I think maybe that's a good explanation.
Thank you very much. Because I've recently noticed there are so many interesting climate litigation rulings from especially South America, and unfortunately these do not receive the same reception in Europe as, for example, European or US American rulings receive in South America. And I think this is something we should definitely learn from this dialogue. I think we have two more questions, and then I would close this panel. There's one more by Triveni Fodera, who wrote in the Q&A section: traditionally, the process of accepting immigrants happened by integrating with the culture of host countries and being politically incorrect. Isn't it incumbent of immigrants to accept and integrate with custom and culture of host countries? If they don't do this, isn't that the main reason behind the pushback from European countries? I think this is a question, especially for Professor Kelemen.
I think, frankly, while I think that it is important over generations, as the questioner suggests, for immigrants to integrate socially, culturally, politically, etc., into their host country, doesn't happen overnight, happens gradually. But while that is important, I think the idea that blaming immigrants for the pushback they are receiving due to inadequate cultural integration, I frankly think that that's the wrong way to think about it. While there have been some problems with immigrant integration in varies across countries in Europe, while there have been some problems, first of all, I'd say that's at least as much, or perhaps much more, due to resistance in the host country, and kind of racism and xenophobia, than it is just by like a refusal to integrate from immigrants. That's number one. And number two, I would just say that in terms of the current pushback, really this current pushback, is more about kind of cultural fears than about even any realities. I mean, think about it. You had big resistance to immigration and fears of immigrant integration, even in countries that had very few immigrants. It's interesting, for instance, now this thing going on in the border in Belarus, actually this has been like a godsend for the far right Law and Justice Party regime, who is just feeding off of this. And so they're very happy that, even though they won't admit it, that Belarus, that the dictator Lukashenko has been sending these migrants from the Middle East to their border. Why? Because, for years, the peace was trying to stir up fear and hatred of immigrants from the Middle East, when the problem was they didn't have any, right? So there weren't any immigrants, going to Poland. And so it was kind of hard to solve that. So then they switched to attacking gays. and LGBTQ community as kind of their main focus, right? But now they've got some migrants again, so they can go back to this. But again, I just don't think it's fair to blame it on the migrants. It all comes, from the populists, really.
Thank you very much. And the last question, is it all, the problems addressed today due to a lack of political will, or does the European legal framework, especially the Lisbon treaties, need an improvement? If so, which improvements and in which areas?
Can I say something about that? I don't know if Professor Sarlet has something to add, but that's really something I've been working on a lot, and I can give a very simple and quick answer. It is not about a lack of tools. The treaties do not need to be revised. And in any case, even if they did need to be revised, it's too late, because treaty revision happens by unanimity. So now that you've already got the Trojan horses and the autocrats inside, you'll never get a decent treaty revision for the time being. So don't try. But the good news is the EU has always had plenty of tools to cut off funding to these regimes. And so, yes, I mean, it is a lack of political will. I guess I don't like always calling it political will, because it kind of makes it seem like it's just, something you could just summon if you had the will or the strength. I think it comes down, unfortunately, to political incentives, right? I don't expect leaders to do the moral thing because they're good. I wish they would, but I don't count on that. I expect them to do what they think is in their interest. And the sad thing is that I think the current state of the EU, without going into great detail, is such that leaders think it can pay off for them politically to, tolerate, these kind of attacks on fundamental values, democracy, human rights. I mean, just think about it for a second. Just to go back to this Merkel example, think about how striking this is. Merkel would never, for a minute, even consider, or she's leaving now, but let's say in the past decade, she would have never considered for a minute entering a coalition domestically with the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, right? She would never allow things to happen in Germany that were happening in Hungary and Poland. But while she wouldn't do that domestically, she was happy to be political allies with Orban for 10 years. Why? I think, it's because the incentives. She knows she'd be punished politically if she entered a coalition with AfD, right? And she knows that no one really knows or cares what happens in Brussels and Strasbourg. And so not to pick on Merkel too much, she's just one, but I think many European leaders understand that they can get away with doing dirty deals with autocrats and not get blamed for it by their voters. So until that changes and until they pay a price, I don't think anything will change.
Thank you for the reply. Professor Sarlet, do you want to say something else? Otherwise, I will close this panel.
I just want to say thank you. It was a really fantastic experience. I wouldn't say better. I just was looking at the news about the Human Rights Court. Poland, a victory yet not a triumph for homosexual parents in Strasbourg, a really brand new decision from the European Court of Human Rights about these issues, what we are talking about. And I really can't only agree, so far as I know, about the European situation and what we are following here outside, what Professor Kelemen had already said. I think you have the tools, but in fact, one must really have the will to change and the political will to do so. And I really hope maybe something changes in this direction. And as well as here in Brazil, we will have elections next year. It will be, of course, a very difficult year, but through difficulties, something new can, of course, be born. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you also. I wanted to give my thanks. Thanks, Professor Sarlet, Manuela, and Professor Coetzer, and our host. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations and insights. It was really delightful. And I'm giving back to Professor Kotzur. Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much, dear Mrs. Niehaus, for leading the panel, and thank you to that wonderful interaction and that wonderful presentations. I learned quite a lot, and I think it was very important that you addressed that the European Union has to be very well aware of its own housekeeping. You know, you cannot transfer values of rule of law and democracy if you're not totally based on democracy and rule of law principles. I think that's been a very important issue, and that's something we discussed yesterday, and that's something I think which will be one of the leading themes for the whole Hamburg-Vigoni Forum, because it's all about, you know, our internal structure, how credible we are, and the issue of credibility and trustworthy really depends on, you know, how you deal things internally, and, you know, how you deal with the kind of, you know, authoritarian tendencies and autocracies that are developing within the European Union. And I think that was extremely thought-provoking what you said. And I'm very thankful that you've been very clear and very outspoken, because sometimes we are kind of, you know, address these questions by ending up with, oh, it's all very complex, and very good that we thought about it and that we spoke about it. You also came up with solutions, with provocative ones, that might also receive critique by some and applause by others. But this is exactly what we want and need, and therefore this has been most fruitful. We are extremely grateful and hope there will be another time and another chance that we can do things together. Thank you very much, and, you know, good afternoon to the US and to Brazil. Thank you. Bye-bye.